Hello, I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this second edition of our new series of online discussions titled Democracies Under Pressure, Challenges for the Global Liberal Order. This series is brought to you by 1014 and the American Council on Germany. After our joint online series, Resilience and Adaptation, which we carried out during the height of the pandemic, Katya and I decided that we wanted to explore the internal and external challenges facing democracies in a transatlantic context, especially now in light of the war in Ukraine. Liberal democracies are already under significant internal pressures. For example, trust in democratic institutions and practices is eroding, and the free media is facing challenges posed by unverified content on social media outlets, and the list goes on. Externally, democracies have been under pressure to find ways in which to engage autocratic regimes to solve global crises such as the ongoing pandemic and mounting climate change. But now Putin's war in Ukraine has underscored yet another challenge to democracy. The question is, will the liberal, rules-based world order survive this blatant breach of sovereignty and humanitarian law that multilateral organizations have been unable to prevent or stop? And is peace even possible with President Putin? To help us answer these and other questions, we're delighted to be joined by Dr. Benjamin Denison. He's a data scientist, political scientist, and international security and foreign policy expert. Ben, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
So Ben's full bio will be posted to the chat, but we are delighted to have you with us. And before I turn the floor over to Katya to lead the discussion, I just wanted to remind our viewers that both ACG and 1014 are independent, nonpartisan organizations, and the views expressed during this webinar are those of our guest. Today, Katya will moderate the discussion, and so if you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function in Zoom, and she will do her best to fold your questions into the conversation. With that, Katya, I hand the floor over to you, and I look forward to an exciting conversation.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Ben, for being with us today. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and let's just jump right in. Let's set the stage with, President Biden. So on March 26th in Poland, in a very emotional speech, President Biden said that Putin cannot remain in power. Of course, the staff immediately clarified that the president was not discussing Putin's power in Russia or regime change, but rather power over his neighbors. Just a week ago in the New York Times on May 31st, President Biden emphasized the need for diplomatic negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. He writes in this guest essay, "As much as I disagree with Mr. Putin and find his actions an outrage, the United States will not try to bring about his ouster in Moscow." But of course, there are many voices in the United States and in Europe that wonder, is peace even possible if President Putin remains in power? And shouldn't he rather be tried before an international war crimes tribunal for his atrocities than have the red carpet rolled out in front of him to negotiate a peace treaty? And in today's news, we have reports that talk about, that ceasefire talks are stalled with no indication that this might change anytime soon. I'm just curious, what is your take on this question? Is peace possible with President Putin?
Well, first, thank you, Katya, for the great introduction and question. I think the important question to ask is peace possible? It's looking increasingly likely that it will take much longer than we initially hoped for any peace negotiation to get started and be completed. But the key feature, I think, in relevance for today's talk is that I still think that there is a possible peace deal with Putin in the future at some point. largely due to the fact that even though we recognize the atrocities that have been committed and kind of how reprehensible some of the actions that Russia has taken in this war, as evidenced by what President Biden said in his March speech, an emotional views of, man, is so hard to negotiate with someone who is, willing to do these types of actions. As evidenced by his recent op-ed, as you point out, there's a recognition that trying to overthrow a government in order to enforce a peace or to promote peace negotiations would actually be more likely to produce even further negative side effects than working with him currently to end the war. And so while it initially seems like it would be it makes logical sense that if Putin is the leader who is the orchestrator of these terrible events in Ukraine, to overthrow him or topple him in some way to allow for peace to come about, it's actually, as my research and others' research has shown, actually more likely to produce way more negative side effects than trying to work to create some peace deal with him still in power in the long run. I think it's important to also clarify before we get further into the discussion that when I'm talking about regime change, there is some debate in the academic community about what exactly counts as regime change. Some individuals focus only on a militarized action to overthrow the government. And so, for instance, some argue that the initial strike that Russia launched on Ukraine earlier this year was a regime change attempt, trying to use military force to topple a government inside of Kyiv. It's very similar to other actions that you can think of. The most canonical examples of various actors taking military force to overthrow governments. But some individuals also talk about covert attempts using different types of operations covertly to try to overthrow the government, support coups against the current leadership, and also working with opposition movements to help them topple the current regime in power. And so when I talk about regime change, I'm often talking about that full range of operations, largely because regimes like Russia see the United States and other actors they view those, attempting to support local opposition movements and, full-scale assault with the military and the regime as kind of variations on the same theme. So as we get into the conversation more today, that is what I'm talking about with regime change, and we can get into a little bit more. But to kind of go back to the main question, unfortunately, I think that trying to overthrow the Putin regime will actually end up making peace less likely in the long term.
So just to clarify, so when you talk about the negative side effects that would outweigh basically the benefit of getting rid of a war criminal, put it bluntly, so you're also talking about doing that by means of supporting the opposition.
Yes. So there is a to kind of briefly walk through, I guess, kind of the negative side effects that might occur to kind of get into further discussion. There's been a growing consensus in the academic community who studies regime change operations that there are a drastic amount of negative side effects that go along with various types of regime change operations. Most notably, there's a high rate of civil war after engaging in regime change, largely because if you impose a new government in power, or the new government put in power is seen as kind of being a proxy for a foreign state, then obviously individuals at home resist that government, and it makes a civil war more likely. Then, in order to maintain their rule, there's increased levels of human rights violations by that new government, largely trying to cement their rule. There are oftentimes worse trade relations and even worse relations with the state that actually imposed the country in the first place. And so these clear negative side effects come about regardless of whether or not you engage in regime change, either overtly, so using military force, or covertly in terms of supporting opposition movements to maybe to start a coup or a revolt against the government. There is a bit of a difference between kind of providing generic support for kind of democracy promotion in certain countries. But once you get into the game of trying to get one certain type of opposition movement to kind of take charge and kind of lead the charge against the current regime, it becomes seen by the regime in power that you are orchestrating, attacks against their own regime security. They get very concerned about, if I fall from power, especially if you're in an authoritarian regime, you're more likely to end up in prison or dead. You don't oftentimes get sent off to retire in a country or state, no longer being a politician. You're going to have some negative personal side effects. And so due to that, there's a real concern that if a foreign actor is trying to work with these opposition groups to topple me, my own personal security is going to be hurt, and I will do everything in my power to maintain my rule. And when you're dealing with a nuclear armed state like Russia, that becomes even more concerning, because now when you have a leader thinking, well, if I lose power, I'm either going to end up in prison or I'm going to end up possibly executed. So I might as well do everything in my power to maintain my rule, whether it be repressing their own citizens even further, or even turning to their nuclear arsenal to threaten, as we've seen President Putin do, to maintain his rule.
Yeah, I would like to hone in on the, you just mentioned the nuclear arsenal, on the nuclear risk, and then maybe go back to supporting the opposition at a later stage in the conversation. So risk reduction, I mean, you mentioned, side effects, and of course, we're dealing with a nuclear power here in this conflict. In your essay in ICSTIC just a few months ago in March, you described a use it or lose it dilemma for Putin if he would find himself in a situation in which his only choice would be to either escalate to a nuclear attack or lose power. Mm-hmm. I think this was a very powerful analysis, and I would just like to hear your thoughts on what are the risks, and in other words, how likely is the risk of a nuclear escalation in this scenario? What is the fine line between a strong united Western response and a provocation that might trigger an escalation of a conflict to become global or nuclear even?
Yeah, so that's a fantastic question. And as you've seen kind of over the months of this war, there's been almost a trial and error method of seeing how far the support for Ukraine could go without triggering a response. And I think that's why, for instance, we've seen so much of the comments made by Biden and his administration, even though sometimes he says things and then it gets walked back by his administration, that's largely focused on how can we stop the external behavior of Russia in Ukraine. So what I mean is kind of their military actions, and also kind of they're trying to project influence into Ukraine, and not focused on, they try to resist saying we are focusing on kind of the governing structure that led to Putin deciding to launch this war. I think as a conscious effort, because they recognize that, especially for authoritarian regimes, regime security is paramount, perhaps even more than state security. So these actors, especially in authoritarian regimes that have nuclear weapons, are concerned about maintaining the rule of their regime or their government itself, and are really worried that foreign actors might try to project influence on their regime and take out their government. And so what we see with these nuclear armed actors is when you see either military or covert action against these regimes, it's often in the period where they're working towards a nuclear weapon, because there's this real concern that if states are obtaining nuclear weapons to protect their regime, once their regime is under threat, they no longer have an incentive to not use those nuclear weapons, in a sense. And so if they are already going to be, the regime is going to be taken down, a fear among many commentators and academics is that they'll get this use it or lose it dilemma, which basically means we should either, if we have a nuclear arsenal, protect our regime. If we don't use it to protect it when it's under threat, then we essentially lose our nuclear arsenal because the regime is already toppled by the time you thought about maybe it might be worth using. And so a lot of action in the nuclear world, it revolves around how do we avoid nuclear armed dictators often feeling like they have to turn to their nuclear arsenal in order to preserve their regime. We see this with North Korea, where once they successfully launched a nuclear test, we kind of modified our negotiations with them a bit, trying to find ways to not make it look like the U.S. and our allies are trying to topple the North Korean regime because we're afraid of the same sort of ideas. And you see kind of with Iran now, as well, some commentators in the U.S. are trying to make the point that once I disagree with these individuals, but their argument is that we need to take out the regime in Iran today, because if they finally do get a nuclear program, then it will be too late because then they will be kind of protected from getting toppled in the future. I would disagree that we should ever be in the business of trying to topple the regime in Iran, but their argument kind of focuses on how do we deal with the regime before they get the protection of the nuclear weapons themselves. And so I think kind of that is one big concern that the United States and its allies are focusing on right now, especially in Ukraine. How can we keep the focus on we need Russia to walk back its external actions. And while we might disagree with kind of the internal politics that led to the ability to launch this war, once they become concerned that you are trying to influence the regime and trying to topple the regime, they're much more willing to go to the nuclear option.
So President Biden, in his op-ed last week that you also cited, he said, he addressed the threat of nuclear escalation, and he, shared his view that he doesn't think that this is actually right now at stake, or that is a, imminent risk. Do you share this assessment, or, do you think that whenever nuclear is involved, you should take a step back?
So my view is very thankfully, we've only had one case of a nuclear strike. And so we don't have that many data points, which is a good thing. But given the amount of catastrophe that can start with just one nuclear strike, I'm of the opinion that we should seek everything that we can to avoid escalating these wars to a nuclear level. And right now, I think Biden is correct that we are not in a position where a nuclear exchange is likely, but I think that is driven by the clear lines we're drawing of we're going to focus on, again, on this external behavior and not on the internal characteristics of Russia. And I think that's a very prudent step to kind of keep the focus on how can we support Ukraine to the best of our ability without crossing the threshold of making Russia's regime security feel under threat, where they'd be much more willing to escalate to a higher level. So I think, nuclear deterrence also works in both directions. So, Russia is also deterred from escalating in some ways, especially to invading different NATO countries, largely because they are afraid of the US nuclear deterrent as well. So while that is holding, we can see this kind of conventional level activity continue. But once we cross the threshold where, it seems like his own personal life might be at stake, that's when things become a lot more worrisome at the nuclear level, because his options are either I end up dead or, I launch a nuclear weapon, and we want to avoid that as much as we can. And I think the Biden administration is doing that so far.
I just have a viewer question here, and I think we can leave the nuclear aspects of the topic for a moment. And the viewer is asking that basically there have been cases of successful regime change over the past years and centuries, actually. Even thinking of Germany, of course, for example, it's a very good example of a very successful regime change after World War II. So the question is, leaving aside the nuclear threat, the notion of regime change, it has been attempted over and over and over again, with many, unsuccessful attempts, but also with a few successful attempts. So is this really, I know you studied that very carefully. There are different books on, why foreign imposed regime changes are going wrong. But is this really always going wrong, or what are the scenarios in which it can actually be successful?
Yeah, it's a great question. There are different studies. Some that even go back to 1500 with city-states overthrowing each other. But for the most part, we studied the time period from 1816 forward, and around 80% of the cases of regime change since then have largely failed to produce a stable outcome. There are some cases. So for instance, the US, invasion of Iraq in 2003 is technically a successful regime change from the standpoint of the regime got changed, but the outcome in terms of what the goal for engaging in regime change was a failure. So there's kind of two different ways to think about success. One is, are you successful in actually carrying out the regime change operation or overthrowing the government? And then there's success in, but given you've done that, did you actually achieve the political goal you were seeking out? And about 80% of the cases, the political goal is not achieved, even if you're successful at toppling the government itself. But there are some important exceptions, especially the World War II cases. So not just Germany, but also Italy, Austria, Japan, South Korea. And these all come around the same time period, right after World War II. Some scholars have looked at this to try to figure out what is different about these cases and what really led to kind of these different outcomes. Because if you look earlier, so especially after World War I, and then especially in Latin America in the early 20th century, there were lots of cases of regime change that largely led to very significant problems. And they weren't successful. And then later on, after World War II, there are cases, Vietnam, the Soviet Union, Afghanistan, that also tried to engage in regime change and didn't succeed. So what was unique about that time period? And what they found is that the preconditions in the state itself, so whether the level of economic development, the previous experience with democracy, and kind of how strong the state was, were really strong predictors of being able to have a stable state that's more likely to become democratic after World War II. And also the threat from a foreign power was also found to be, so when states were really concerned that the Soviet Union might be coming in to occupy them instead of the United States, they were more willing to kind of go along with the United States and rebuild their government. So they didn't face that threat. But the other main thing that comes out of these studies is that just the level of destruction in terms of, there was such a long war in World War II, and the population was so devastated that there wasn't really any capacity left to resist. And that's kind of a unique moment in history that comes about largely because the untold civilian devastation that was in Europe and Asia due to the war that came after these 5 years. And what we did see is that there was kind of earlier periods of resistance as well against when the Nazi regime in Germany was trying to overthrow some of these governments as well. And so in some of the cases outside of Germany and Japan and Italy specifically, when there was a restoration of a former regime in place that was toppled by Germany at the beginning of the war, those are the most successful cases in regime change, because bringing in someone who has been the ruler in the past is almost always the best chance to have success. But throughout history, that's kind of like the only time period where we've really seen kind of the sustained period of success in these operations. It's largely because the preconditions that were there and the level of devastation that was wrought that kind of reduced the ability to resist.
There's one viewer who would like to know about your assessment in Iraq, thinking that, was that a successful regime change that the United States attempted when toppling Saddam Hussein in 2003? Would you consider that successful? Is Iraq now a stable country and, was the original idea of going into Iraq being accomplished?
So I would not consider it a success. So it is a success again, and in the point of view of that, did the regime change operation actually overthrow the government? It did do that. But the political goal that was, there's still debate. I'm not sure, we're still debating the origins of World War I. So I'm not sure, given that, I'm not sure we're ever going to agree on what exactly the political goal for the Iraq war was. But through all the different reasons for engaging that the policymakers themselves gave, whether it be promoting Middle East stability, promoting democracy in the Middle East, reducing WMD proliferation, all of those cases, political reasons that were justifications for the overthrow of the regime in Iraq are basically been proven incorrect. There's less stability in the Middle East. Democracy did not flourish like they thought from Baghdad. And then there was also the Iraq war is now given, for instance, as an example by Iran, by North Korea, and other aspirant nuclear states as, why would we give up our nuclear arsenal or give up a nuclear program if we think that the only thing that prevents the United States from engaging in regime change is having a nuclear arsenal in the first place? So in my view, it's not a success for those reasons. If you look at the initial plan It's kind of it's a little bit crazy. They largely modified it, looked at it based on the liberation of France, thinking that we could go in very quickly, put someone in power, and then leave. And this is kind of what you see from a lot of regime changers throughout history, is that they have this idea that you can just put someone in power that will agree with your foreign policy and agree with your political goals, and they'll be able to sort out all the political details themselves. And so your military can leave. And that's basically almost never the case. It's you always end up with an occupation force, even in the successful cases. In Germany, as we just mentioned, the initial plan was basically to quickly overthrow the government, and then U.S. forces would leave. And we still have U.S. bases in Germany to this day. And the formal occupation lasted almost 10 years. And so that basically never, is never carried out. So given that that was the goal, I would say that Iraq was not a successful case of regime change. And if you ask the Iraqis themselves, I would be curious actually to know kind of how they view it.
That's, I think one case that most scholars who argue against the policy of regime change point out is Afghanistan. You see everybody try to topple the Taliban regime, and what do you have now? Taliban power. So that's always a very strong case that scholars make. But let's go back to Russia, and just wondering, when we talk about all this, history of successful, unsuccessful regime changes, I think the situation that we have here, that we're dealing with here, is a little bit different, because we do have a flagrant violation of international law with Russia going into another country, like invading another country. So that is certainly different than going into, having a regime that is, in our views, bad for one reason or the other. So we do have a flagrant violation of international law. So does that change sort of, the parameters in which we should discuss, possible regime change in Russia? And the second question would be, when you talk about the conditions that have to be in place to make a regime change successful, democratic, conditions, and all this that you mentioned. Do you see that in parts in Russia today? And isn't there like some democratic structure, media structure that you can build up to possibly make this a successful case?
Yeah, so those are two fantastic questions. So the first one kind of on, I guess, questions of legitimacy and violations of international law. A lot of the justifications, especially in the recent, especially since the end of the Cold War, for engaging in regime change, have been premised kind of on these questions of human rights and international law, trying to find justifications saying governments have lost their consent. They've lost the consent of the governed, essentially, by saying they've committed crimes against their own populations. And so that's been some of this, so while this is different in that the arguments are they've committed crimes against a foreign population, there have been these justifications in the past used trying to say that these, the way they're supporting human rights violations against, or the way they're perpetrating human rights violations inside their own country makes them lose the legitimacy, and they no longer are the rightful rulers. And so this kind of rhetoric has been used to justify regime change. The problem remains that while it could be the case that, like, from a normative standpoint, that is correct, and from they did commit these legal violations, that doesn't get you past the negative externalities that come out of actually engaging in regime change itself. So it could be completely correct that this is an awful regime, and that in an ideal world we would get rid, it would disappear. To be clear, my stance is not that we should help maintain these regimes. It's that foreign action itself to overthrow this regime is often what leads to these negative externalities. We see lots of good outcomes that come about from domestically led organic movements that rise up to topple nefarious regimes. You don't have these same next negative externalities, largely because they have legitimacy at home. One of the main problems with foreign regime change is that by being kind of sponsored by a foreign actor, you become seen as an illegitimate regime yourself. And so that's where this protest movement at home against you. Actually, if you look throughout history, the leaders with the shortest term in office, if you look at kind of the average length in office, is leaders that were installed by foreign powers. They get killed at very high rates, usually because, the old military or just the old regime itself comes back to power and topples them, largely because the foreign actor doesn't want to spend, lots of money on keeping them in place. And so it's actually a very, when you don't have that domestic legitimacy at home, it becomes very difficult to maintain your regime in power. And so while I think it is true that Russia has, violated international law and is doing, terrible things in Ukraine, that fact itself doesn't overcome the negative externalities that are likely to be produced inside Russia itself. And it's worth flagging that we also don't know, it's a complete unknown if, to say the Putin regime did collapse or was overthrown, what future regime in Russia itself would look like. Even if the initial regime that would get reinstalled would be more pro-US or more pro, or just kind of the antithesis of the Putin regime, we often see these nationalist backlashes to installed leaders. So 5 years, 10 years down the line, you could actually end up with an even more nationalistic regime that takes its place and becomes even more anti-Europe, anti-US, because it feels like you have installed this regime upon us. And now we are going to be even more militant and nationalistic. So that is a real concern of mine in this case, as we often like to think if we were to topple the regime, a more pleasant one would come in its place. And there's no guarantee that would actually happen. And oftentimes the act of a foreign actor imposing regime makes it more likely that a nationalistic regime would be installed in the future. Can you repeat the second question? I rambled on a little bit too much, so I just want to make sure I remember it correctly.
Yeah, no, the second question was, you mentioned a couple of conditions that have to be in place to make regime change successful. And I was just wondering if you see any of those conditions being, being there in Russia today.
Yeah, so the conditions that were similar to kind of to World War II might be a little bit more in existence in Russia than they are in many other cases. That Russia is not Afghanistan. And so there is kind of more developed infrastructure. There's more developed state capacity, although there are some questions about how much of Russian state capacity has been destroyed over the past couple of decades as Putin's trying to consolidate his rule. Oftentimes when you're an autocrat, you engage in something called coup proofing. And so you're trying to prevent different political bodies and military bodies in your regime from having the capacity to overthrow you. And so you kind of destroy your state capacity. For instance, the US thought Iraq had more state capacity than it actually did in 2003 because we were basing it on assessments made in the 1990s without realizing that during that decade, there was a major coup proofing undergone by Saddam. And so that's one thing that we have to keep in mind. But I think the condition of kind of economic conditions and maybe even, bureaucratic capacity exist. One major issue, though, that I didn't mention in preconditions is that the cases in World War II involved a sustained occupation force and a sustained economic commitment that hasn't been matched in pretty much any regime change operation since. From the beginning, the U.S. was committed to having a robust occupation force with essentially an American military governor in each region, kind of running the local institutions until turning them over to a future until a local government was deemed sufficient that they could turn it over to. And with the Marshall Plan and other economic commitments, we were committing, I'm trying to remember, I think it was close to 5% of GDP to the Marshall Plan. And it was just a sustained level of economic commitment that we have not been willing to make. And so if you were to ask, the US government, are you willing to topple the Putin regime if it requires a 10-year occupation of Russia and $1 trillion in expenditure? And with Russia, it's probably closer to $2 or $3 trillion in expenditure. The answer would probably be no. And so that's kind of one precondition that oftentimes people think that regime change is a quick and easy option. When you see policymakers decide to engage in regime change, they pretty much never think it will take very long. I call this the Gilligan's Island problem, where they think they're signing up for a 3-hour tour and they end up, occupying a country for 10 years. And throughout history, the same problem is repeated over and over and over again. And once you say up front that we could engage in regime change, but in order to have the political goal you want, it's going to take a sustained occupation force with military, troops in Russia itself, and sustained level, the monetary commitment to go along with it. That makes me think that it's that level of commitment doesn't exist, and that overlooks the entire problem of how do you actually get that occupation force into the country itself in a nuclear armed state, which I think is basically unlikely. So I think there are some conditions where, say, a domestic group rises up to topple the Putin regime. It probably would, go a little bit better than, say, Afghanistan, than the previous case we were talking about. But the level of commitment required for a US or European-led regime change mission, I think, doesn't exist.
Okay, that's interesting. So let's talk about sanctions. We haven't mentioned sanctions yet. And of course, the West has imposed sanctions to end the war, to put pressure on the regime, not necessarily to change the regime. But, if we look at South Africa, you have a good example of regime change inflicted by severe sanctions. Mm-hmm. So one of our audience members is wondering, what role might growing discontent in Russia play as a result of sanctions to weaken Putin's position?
So South Africa is the one case you mentioned where sanctions might have worked to help, topple the apartheid regime. But the U.S. specifically has been trying to use sanctions for essentially regime change reasons in other nuclear armed states, such as North Korea and Iran, and other states as well, trying to Venezuela, in addition, and basically trying to isolate these countries under the logic that we could make the foreign population so angry at their governments that they will topple them themselves, rather than requiring a U.S. Involvement or a global involvement. In basically none of those cases, however, has the actual population become so outraged at the government itself. They often become more outraged at the U.S. for leading the sanctions, largely because they feel like the population is being unfairly targeted for actions that were taken by the government. And so there hasn't been this same level of this theory. It sounds good in theory that if the population feels like they are being pressured and their material well-being is being harmed because the government is unwilling to scrap their nuclear program or scrap whatever program the U.S. finds objectionable, they will view it, as willing to topple the government or put pressure on the government to stop it. In reality, in most of these cases, you don't really see that actually happening, and it leads to greater, viewing the sanctioner as the real problem and put pressure on them itself. I think, unfortunately, we've overused, I'm not a pure expert on sanctions, but in my own personal views is that we have been using sanctions as the de facto regime change tool for the past 20 years, especially. And we've overused them to the point that now sanctions are almost tied in with seen as regime change tools. And that leads to regimes to find ways to resist it even more forcefully than they might otherwise would have. If we were more prudent in using sanctions, for instance, if we had not been sanctioning Iran and Venezuela, North Korea, trying to overthrow the regime as much, and then had them in place, then, okay, now that Russia has, violated international law, we're going to make a really forceful statement by engaging these sanctions, they might have been more successful. I don't know. We'd have to get a time machine and rerun the experiment. But I think that's one negative side effect, is that American overuse of sanctions has made these states view sanctions as targeted at regime change. There's even evidence in China, for instance, that they view American sanctions as de facto regime change in some ways. And so they're trying to find ways to make sure that if we decide that we don't like something that China does, that they will not be targeted by the same or not be affected by the same level of sanctions. So I think, unfortunately, a lot of our policymakers have not thought about how attempts at regime change with various tools in the past are now affecting our policy options today, and what options we're choosing today, how they might affect, 20, 30, 40 years down the line. Because especially, authoritarian regimes, they think in much longer time periods, than especially the US. We usually think in only 2 or 4 year, election cycles. And we don't think, what happened 10 years ago matters as much.
Election cycle, that's makes me think of another question. So, we've been talking about whether, peace with Putin is possible and regime change, Western-led regime change in Russia would be good or bad or feasible even. But we have not talked about Russia's disruptive potential previously. So Russia has a history of disruption. And we all know they interfered in the 2016 elections, and they will likely interfere in the upcoming midterm election as well. They, in France, tried to support Marine Le Pen. I mean, so there's engagement all over the place, basically. So also aimed at putting a specific regime in place. So would you consider that a regime change policy, or, what's your assessment of actually what Russia has been doing with regard to its, the West?
So as I mentioned at the very beginning of the talk, there's kind of two different camps of people who think about regime change. I'm much more in the expansive camp. So I do think that Russia has been trying to influence regimes. And I don't think, there are differences in terms of like where you fall on the scale, but you're on the same scale, I guess, of how the actions you're taking. And so I do view Russia as engaging in various, regime change actions. Even their actions in Syria, for instance, to maintain the Assad regime, basically count, in my opinion, as a de facto regime change policy. The U.S. and its European allies have done similar things in the past, where we feel like an outside actor is trying to influence a during the Cold War regime that we like. We're going to go and try to protect that regime from oftentimes it was Soviet influence during the Cold War. And I think for Russia, they view a lot of this and what they're carrying out as kind of my reading on kind of how they talk about this stuff is it's a continuation of what was happening during the Cold War, where, as we mentioned at the end of World War II, right as, the U.S. was ending its occupations in places such as Italy, you had, basically the Soviet Union and the U.S. kind of competing in a de facto. They were each kind of trying to influence different parts of Italy in the election, trying to make sure their preferred party would win. You saw this also in France, in Germany and Austria, because it was partitioned. It was less, it was kind of each had their own area. But in these countries that had kind of this divide, there was a clear kind of competition. This continued throughout the Cold War, and Russia largely kind of, they view, I think, what's been happening with U.S. democracy promotion and kind of regime change policy as a continuation of what was happening in the Cold War. While the U.S. will say, no, democracy promotion is a completely different animal. We are just trying to support the general level of democracy around the world. And I agree that's a good thing to promote. It's important to keep in mind that Russia kind of, I think, still views it in this term of this is like competing, these are competing systems, or at least competing influence about, who is more pro-US versus, maybe more in line with Russia's own foreign policy. But I think that led Russia, especially in the recent years, to be much more willing to engage in these types of actions, to try to subvert elections and try to kind of cause chaos. I'm not so certain that they were specifically trying to get leaders, like they actively went out and said, I want this leader to be elected, but more kind of what will cause the maximum amount of chaos in the US and in France, I think was more their goal, just trying to be disruptive. But I think that's largely what's been going on. And I do think that, we are now taking seriously this idea that Russia is trying to influence our elections, or at least I hope we are taking it as seriously, much more seriously. And I think we now have caught up to the idea that they haven't actually stopped these influence activities that they were trying during the Cold War and have continued on and on.
Yeah. Well, I think it's fair enough to say, at least, in Europe, I think Russia's aim was sort of to weaken Europe by trying to help leaders get into power who would be anti-European, and sort of divide Europe by weaken Europe this way. So that's probably fair enough to say. But let's just focus on Ukraine for a minute, and then I would like to end this talk with geopolitical view. So looking at Ukraine. So Ukraine, of course, is trying on all levels sort of to fight this aggression. And one is also to broadcast into Russia news, to basically tell the Russian people what's going on. And there's one news channel, February Morning, which was actually been launched by a Russian who was a member of parliament and voted against the Crimean attack in 2015, and then went to Ukraine. So now you have 70 Ukrainian and Russians, actively working sort of to broadcast news into Russia. Are you concerned about that too? Because earlier on you mentioned, if the Western alliance, would try to support any opposition, the opposition could be actually weakened because they would, be viewed as Western proxies, and that would have negative side effects. Is that also hold true for Ukrainian attempts sort of to topple Putin, President Putin?
My view would be that, or my view is, not would be, my view is that as long as these are kind of organic Ukrainian and Russian actors themselves carrying out this news, I think it's a great way to kind of try to create influence and try to point out all the things that are being undertaken in the name of the Russian people, to try to get them more involved in politics and saying, maybe resist some of the actions that are being taken in their name. I would become concerned when it was kind of almost if it was, US-led propaganda campaigns, or we were the ones funding, or the EU was funding these actions, just because once you get that small sliver that it could be tied to US, it provides the opportunity for Russia to essentially say, oh, we can discount all this because it's all propaganda. Now, unfortunately, they do largely do this already and just say everything is, Western propaganda against them. But the more you can kind of show, no, this is an authentic Russian source. These are, the normal Ukrainian people. There's no US or EU ties at all. I think it will become more effective. This is a complete side note. There's a great documentary that about Finland and Estonia during the Cold War. Actually, I'm trying to remember. I think it's called Atomic Disco. Is the name of the documentary? But it shows that one of the most successful things that the West did during the Cold War to kind of influence Soviet attitudes was they would just play in Finland TV shows like Dallas and like American soap operas. And all these people would get illegal TV antennas basically to import the US TV shows into their homes. And it was found like that was, much more, just that simple act itself did a lot to kind of change attitude. So that kind of action of public diplomacy, I'm less concerned about than about kind of actively staking out, we are going to support this group because we want them to come to power.
Thank you so much, Ben. So let's just end this talk on a hypothetical note. So let's just assume President Putin is disposed and replaced one way or the other. How will Russia's geopolitical alliance change if this would happen? And especially, would Russia's ties to China weaken in a post-Putin scenario? This is a question that has been asked by one of the ACG board members in the chat.
So I think it really would depend on how exactly Putin would be replaced. So there's kind of, I guess, three ways, that he could be replaced. One is an organic uprising of some sort. So this is a group of individuals, either opposition movement or in the military or some way, without any influence from any outside actor, just decides we are going to overthrow the regime. I think in that case, it's much more likely that they would try to find some way to become more, maybe not aligned with, Europe, but just less non-aligned, I guess is better way to say it. And specifically with China, in that case, I'm not, it would all depend on if China is trying to stake out kind of itself as a separate pole from the US in the West, or as a, part of the same global environment. If it's a Western-led toppling, my hunch is at the beginning, the regime would be more pro-West and against China. But I think this nationalist backlash would eventually happen, where it would probably draw China and Russia together. China especially is also concerned. We don't talk about this very much, at least in the US, but China also has perceptions that the US might be interested in toppling its regime. And so we've seen various meetings between Russia and China about this topic. For instance, right before the Summit of Democracies, earlier at the end of 2021, both foreign ministers from Russia and China put out a joint op-ed basically saying, America is trying to influence our governments. And so I think if it was, a US involved or a European involved toppling of the Russian regime, you'd get this nationalist backlash that would push them closer together. And then if it's kind of just a natural Putin steps aside or something else happens where it's not, it just kind of, I think then we're going to probably get a more tame version of the current path, maybe get a peace agreement and probably kind of stay along the same alignment. But I think if you're really concerned about pushing Russia and China together, the worst thing you can do is actually confirm both of their fears that the US is out to influence their regimes. I think maintaining the focus on external behavior and offering opportunities to both China and Russia to say, we are not interested in your internal affairs, but we are concerned about your external behavior, and we're going to laser focus on how we can work together or work, or stop your external activities. I think that is the most effective way to avoid a future where we have a kind of a Russia-China alliance against the US and the West.
Thank you so much, Ben, for this wonderful discussion and for actually, clarifying a lot of the implications that regime change would entail, which I think, to many, it seems like a very intuitive, good, quick solution to the problem. But, as you explained, there are many pitfalls involved. And I guess, that's also the reason, of course, why the Western Alliance doesn't actively pursue this path. So thank you very much. And I think, one thing also became clear: there is no peace without Russia. And hopefully, we'll get the Ukrainians and Russians to the table and to find a solution quickly before more atrocities are committed, and just to end this bloodshed quickly. So thank you very much for joining us today. It's very good to talk to you, hear your insights and your research on this topic. And to our viewers, thank you so much for joining us today, for viewing, tuning in. And you're invited to join us again in 2 weeks when we discuss energy security in Europe and the United States. So thank you very much, and have a very nice day. Goodbye.